All right, so last week we left off just introducing the adrenal gland, and specifically we're going to look at the adrenal cortex. And what we should have, I think, identified is that the cortex actually has three distinct layers. Did we talk about those? We called them zones. So we're working like outside in. The outermost layer would be what? Well, so the capsule, yes, would protect it. And so what about our zones, though? I'm going to do a spelling test here. All right, so the cortex itself, the outermost zone is called the zona glomerulosa. Does anybody recall, did we give the name of the hormones which it produces? Classes? All right, so we'll get there in just a second. The next layer is called the what? Zona fasciculata. And the next layer is referred to as the zona reticularis. So these are three distinct layers of the adrenal cortex, which produce, collectively, we could just call corticosteroids. That's just a generic word for steroids, which arise from the adrenal cortex. What we're going to do is give an example of each of the three classes of corticosteroids. Before we give the names of the different types of corticosteroids, just to review, how can we control the adrenal cortex and its release of corticosteroids? How can we control it? Tropically, by the anterior pituitary, which itself is controlled, right? So you can back it up, but directly controlled by the anterior pituitary's release of. It's just tropic, yeah. So which hormone is it? From the anterior.
AC something H. ACH.
Very good. ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone. ACTH from the anterior pituitary targets the adrenal cortex. So each of the three layers of the adrenal cortex are tropically regulated by anterior pituitary, ACTH. What we're going to learn is that many of these layers are controlled by additional factors as well. But for each of those layers, we're going to say it's at least controlled how? Tropically by anterior pituitary's release of ACTH. The zona glomerulosa, right next to your image that you labeled last time, next to the zona glomerulosa, these cells, this thin layer of cells, produces a class of hormones or corticosteroids called mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids. Mineral. So the zona glomerulosa produces mineralocorticoids. So they're still corticosteroids, or being a little bit more specific, these have something to do with mineral levels. The zona fasciculata produces, do we know what they produce? Very good, glucocorticoids. These probably have something to do with glucose levels. What about the zona reticularis? Do we know what those produce? They produce sex hormones, and so we could say gonadocorticoids, which are sex steroid hormones. So each layer of the adrenal cortex is going to produce a unique class of corticosteroid hormones. Notice the plurality, the S, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, gonadocorticoids. that tells us if more than one type of hormone is actually released from each layer. And so we're not going to go through all of the hormones. We're going to look at all the mineralocorticoids, all the glucocorticoids. We're just going to pick one of each. We're going to pick some famous ones and just talk about how they're regulated and what they are primarily responsible for.
How does cortisone play into all these?
Cortisone is a type of glucocorticoid. So it can be regulated tropically by the ACTH from the anterior pituitary and be released. So we'll cover it in about 10 minutes. Hopefully we'll get there. So it itself is a glucocorticoid. The next image is just to help illustrate for you that when I use the word mineralocorticoid, glucocorticoid, gonatocorticoid, we're looking at a variety of hormones which can be released. Furthermore, it reiterates something that we learned way back in the beginning of the semester, in that our steroid hormones actually get their origin from which molecule? If I want to make a steroid, I first need what's the template molecule for our steroids?
Sugar.
It's not a sugar, and it's not a protein either. Some kind of fat, some kind of lipid. What kind of lipid? Cholesterol. Okay, cholesterol, sterol. Cholesterol is our template molecule for all of our steroid hormones that we're going to study. And so each of these arrows is really summarizing a metabolic pathway. So we're not going to go into the metabolism of aldosterone. We're not going to go into the metabolism of cortisol, adrenal, or whatever, right? We're just going to say the zona glomerulosa makes aldosterone, which is a steroid hormone which first got its origins from cholesterol. Same thing for our glucocorticoids. They also started out as cholesterol and they get modified. And same thing for our gonatocorticoids. They also originate as cholesterol and they're modified to precursors, right? Androstenedione, testosterone, and etc. They can be processed too. Okay. In these pathways, we're going to look at aldosterone from the zona glomerulosa. We're going to look at cortisol from the zona fasciculata, and we're just going to say androgens for the zona reticularis. So we're first going to turn our attention to the zona glomerulosa. It produces what? Things called mineralocorticoids. So go ahead and write that down. It produces a class of hormones called mineralocorticoids. You might catch the name of the one that we're going to talk about. Aldosterone. So the mineralocorticoid that we're going to mention is called aldosterone. There are 4 methods of its regulation. The first one you should be able to tell me. It is regulated tropically by the anterior pituitary's release of ACTH. We're at the adrenal cortex, so to regulate it, we need anterior pituitary ACTH. Okay, that is one mechanism for the control of aldosterone release. ACTH from the anterior pituitary can stimulate the release of our mineralocorticoids. But it's not the only mechanism. This thing is a mineralocorticoid. It regulates our what? Minerals. So it's probably also controlled how? Humorally. Okay, very good. It's also humorally controlled in response to changing sodium and potassium levels. You will see aldosterone released when your blood sodium levels are below set point and or your blood potassium levels are above set point. Can trigger this release of aldosterone. So it's also humorally regulated, declining blood sodium and or exceeding blood potassium levels. These are two of the ways. It's tropically regulated by ACTH, humorally regulated by declining blood levels of sodium and exceeding levels of potassium. Furthermore, if we look at additional regulators, it's tropically regulated by a hormone that we have not studied yet. We won't study it till the very end, maybe the last week of class. Hormone called renin, which is produced by the what? What can we see? Kidney. You recall the kidney is a secondary endocrine gland, and it can release renin. So the release of renin will initiate additional release of aldosterone. So these first three regulators, the tropic ACTH, the humoral declining levels of sodium, and the tropic release of renin, all initiate aldosterone release. They promote its release. The last one inhibits the release of aldosterone. The last hormone is called atrial natriuretic peptide. Where does that come from? Atrial natriuretic peptide. The heart. Okay. So if atrial natriuretic peptide is released by the heart, what happens to our aldosterone release? If AMP is present, well, what happens to my my aldosterone levels? It inhibits, so the levels will what? Decrease, drop. So this fourth pathway, if AMP is present, this pathway will inhibit. There's no more aldosterone release. Does anybody know what aldosterone primarily targets? Targets the kidneys. That's its major target. It's not its only target. But at the kidneys, it's going to target the, what do you think it'll tell the kidneys to do? What do you think it'll tell the kidneys to do? Not directly, indirectly it will. What can it directly tell the kidneys to do?
Okay, water?
She said water, so I said not directly water.
Filter.
Let's go back. So all you said water, so let's go back. This thing monitors what? Sodium and potassium. Levels of sodium which are low. So what can we do to the kidneys if my sodium levels are too low? Reabsorb them. So what it tells your kidneys to do is reabsorb sodium. So it's going to filter out anyway, but we don't want it to go into urine. So it promotes sodium reabsorption. We reabsorb it, it goes back into your blood and brings your sodium levels back up to set point. The indirect effect, though, is if I keep sodium, what's going to follow it? Like a little puppy dog. Water, osmosis is doing. So it will indirectly promote water reabsorption. Okay, but directly it targets the kidney tubules to promote sodium reabsorption and the excretion of your potassium, right, to bring each of those ions back to that point. Secondarily, we create an osmotic gradient so that water is reabsorbed. Not only does it bring our solute concentrations to set point, it also brings our what? What does this stand for?
Blood volume.
Blood volume and blood pressure back up to set point. So the primary target for aldosterone is at the kidneys, at the tubes, which we'll study at the very end of the semester, to retain sodium and therefore water in the blood. That'll bring our blood volume, blood sodium, and blood pressure back up to set point. I don't have it here, but I just want to mention it to you out of interest. Aldosterone also initiates the thirst mechanism. So if you've ever felt thirsty, what hormone is high in your body? Aldosterone. And what does it tell you to do? What does it drive you to do? drink water, which would bring your blood volume back up to set point. Aldosterone promotes thirst mechanism. These 4 controllers for the release of aldosterone are summarized in the image shown at the bottom of your guided notes. If you notice the first 3 pathways on the left, so ACTH we said is a type of tropic regulation. When it's present, we can promote the release of aldosterone. We also said humorally, low levels of sodium and or exceeding potassium levels of potassium can bring aldosterone release from the cortex. Then we said another hormone called renin from the kidney initiates the release of aldosterone. So all 3 of these pathways are stimulatory for the release of aldosterone. If you compare those pathways to the AMP from the heart, you notice the line is dashed. That means that has an inhibitory effect for the release of aldosterone. So if AMP is present, we stop releasing aldosterone, we stop doing what? Reabsorbing sodium, and then we stop retaining water, and our blood volume will go down to set point, and your blood, what else? Pressure will go down to set point. And so the heart, when it's just stretching so much, will release AMP. The kidneys help me out. This is too much for me to handle. That is one of 3 hormones from, or classes of hormones that we're going to study from the adrenal cortex. What questions do you have over aldosterone at this point? Because it integrates the cardiovascular system and the kidneys, that means we're going to talk about aldosterone in chapter 14 and also in 18 and 19 at the end of the semester, so you'll see it repeated. The next layer of the adrenal gland is called the zona fasciculata, and it releases a class of steroids called glucocorticoids. The hormone that we're going to focus on is called cortisol, but some other ones that you may have heard of before, corticosteroid or hydrocortisone. Have you heard of those? Corticosteroids. And they all collectively are glucocorticoids. So we summarized earlier, they're going to have to do with maintenance of what? Glucose. And we're going to say other nutrients as well. Hands down, it's at least going to be regulated how? Tropically by the anterior pituitary's release of ACTH. Yes, it's also controlled by other humoral factors. So let's just get this one down first. Okay? It's definitely controlled by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. However, it's also humorally regulated. I just have the word stress. There's many different stress factors that may be present in the blood. So add the term humorally. Okay? Humoral stress factors can trigger the release of our glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. And so some examples of humoral stress factors may be just elevated temperature. It may be increased immune paraffin messengers, for example. It may be changing levels of glucose in the blood, for example, or examples of stress factors. So cortisol, our other glucocorticoids, are not only tropically regulated, but also humorally regulated by other, what we consider stress factors in the blood. Because it helps us deal with various types of long-term stress, it's going to have system-wide effects. So it's not going to target just, say, just the liver or just the brain or whatever. It's going to target the bulk of the cells in your body. And what it does is it regulates metabolics. the nutrient sources of a particular cell type. So it will enhance carbohydrate metabolism, right? So sugars, proteins. It also has an anti-inflammatory effect and immunosuppressive effect as well, correlating to the stress response. An easy way to summarize what these glucocorticoids do is they prolong the sympathetic nervous system effects. Again, our glucocorticoids prolong our sympathetic nervous system effects. So let's just take a step back. What does that mean? Prolong the sympathetic nervous system effects. What does the sympathetic nervous system do? What do we call it? Fight or flight nervous system. And what happens during the fight or flight to your body? Prepares for action. How do we prepare for action? Increase blood flow, oxygen intake, some hormones, okay, may be changed. What else? Decreased digestive, respiratory rate may go up. Nutrient levels, which way should they go? They should go up, right? Because you're trying to power through, right, some type of physical event, right? Essentially physical event. And so where the sympathetic nervous system takes off and it ends, cortisol can pick up our glucocorticoids, right? So if you have a stressor that is longer than a few milliseconds and a few minutes, your body can adapt, if you will, or deal with that stress by the release of the glucocorticoids such as cortisol. Okay. So the question is, well, then what's stress? Stress could be perceived right in the brain, so just worrying about something, or it could be real, like just waking up for the day. Getting up, like getting up and going for the day takes an extra boost of energy. And so your cortisol will be secreted to help get your nutrients mobilized so you can get up and get going, brain alert, and so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be catastrophic stress, right? It's just getting up and going for the day. You're going to need an extra boost of nutrients. So cortisol can help mobilize those nutrient sources. But certainly when we think about diseases where someone has long-term stress, so like an injury, right, a physical injury, and that impacts how they walk and sit and think, right? They're just focused on it, right? And it has so that's a prolonged nagging type of stress. And so our body is going to have a prolonged secretion of cortisol and other glucocorticoids to try to eliminate any inflammation or the damage may be, and give them energy to deal with that extra non-resting type of tissue activity. So cortisol is necessary for a long-term control of stress, whether it be bad, if you will, long-term like you're thinking, or just even minute, like getting up and going for the day. So it's an important part of our daily balance.
Will your body just continually make it, just over constantly, or will it eventually deplete?
It could deplete if someone is exceedingly ill, okay, or exceedingly just mentally fatigued and stressed. They can deplete their hormones, and then therefore their ability to deal with stress goes down, and so they might be susceptible like heart failure or something. If something they need to run and they can't, they don't have the nutrients, for example. So in prolonged extreme stress, you could right, they talk about fatigue, adrenal fatigue, as you kind of run out of those hormones. So it's definitely not a scenario that you want to be in. You want to be able to deal with that stress and then be done with it and be back to the set point and healthy. But yeah, that's a common thing, and a lot of people don't believe in it, even though there's data out there to support that adrenal fatigue does exist and the immune response, stress response is declined for that persistent stress. That's a good question. Any other questions about our glucocorticoids? All All right, we're going to go to the next layer, which is called the zona reticularis. It produces for us our what? Sex hormones. We can call them gonatocorticoids. That tells us they're sex hormones from the adrenal cortex, and androgens. And so you'll find some masculinizing like hormones in both genders. So precursors to testosterone and estrogens can be manufactured and released here. How is it controlled? Tropically by anterior pituitary's release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH. There may be additional tropic, like other our gonadotropins. I'm not sure, they may play in there as well, but definitely the tropic ACTH release regulates the release of the gonatocorticoids. These are going to target also system-wide, so not going to target just, say, the brain or liver or whatever. They're going to target system-wide, and they're there to supplement the sex steroid hormones from the gonads. Important for appearance of the secondary sex characteristics like masculinization of the boys, axillary hair, strengthening or increasing the musculature of muscles, okay, increasing the protein content within them, are some functions of the hormones from the zona reticularis. What I want to now do is turn our attention back to the adrenal glands. We've talked about the cortex, but we need to review also the medulla. What is the medulla release? Where did we see the medulla previously? Where do we see it? We talked about it when we were in, not the medulla, the adrenal medulla. Medulla is the middle, not the brain itself, but what? It's not the, I want you to clarify your statements. It's not the brain stem. It's not the brain, that's part of the brain stem. Where did we talk about the adrenal medulla? Well, we talked about not the central, the peripheral nervous system. What part? Like nerves go to which nerves go to it? Not
apparent.
Which efferent nerves? Neural. Neural artery. It's relevant. Yeah. Somatic was mentioned. Now, somatic gives us what? Somatic gives us voluntary muscle movement. So this is our autonomic nervous system. We said it's subdivided. Sympathetic nervous system. We became familiar with the adrenal medulla when we studied chapter 11. The adrenal medulla has cells in there which function as modified postganglion cells. And so these are part of your fight or flight response. So the adrenal medulla also helps you deal with what? Stress. What kind of stress? Maybe, may not be. But stress that is what? So the nervous system controls things that are what? Could be scary though. Step back to the very beginning of the semester. We're in the endocrine system, and we just came off the nervous system. These two systems control. What do we say the differences? The differences are long term by the endocrine system. So this is part of our nervous system. So it deals with what kind of stress? Short-term stress. The adrenal medulla releases neurohormones into the blood that allows us to deal with short-term stress. Okay, so the startling, right? It could be a horror movie, right, or whatever the case it may be, but it's going to be something that's not prolonged. So the adrenal medulla is going to release primarily epinephrine, but some norepinephrine may be released from it as well. How is this controlled then? Not tropically. Neurally, by which nervous system?
Peripheral?
Peripheral autonomic sympathetic nervous system. Right, so the adrenal medulla is going to release epinephrine into the blood when the sympathetic nervous system tells it to, based on how you're perceiving, right, some events. Right, so it's just autonomically going to purge epinephrine into the blood, reminding you now that this neurotransmitter is in the blood, we can technically call it a neurohormone. Okay, so it's a neurohormone leached into the blood to help us deal with short-term stress events. And so we know epinephrine, norepinephrine is going to target basically the entire body by binding to which type of receptors? What type of receptors? Adrenergic receptors bind to, you could say adrenaline or you could say epinephrine. Adrenergic receptors. Beta adrenergic, alpha adrenergic receptors. And so we gave epinephrine as an example of all the diversity of activating a second messenger system using those adrenergic receptors. So what's the function of epinephrine? What's the handle of short-term stress? Okay. Or what we call that fight or flight response. Are all stressors short-term? No. No? Fortunately, no. And then so the adrenal gland collectively can help us deal with stress. So our short-term stress is handled by the what? Adrenal medulla. Long-term or prolonged stress handled by the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, the primary hormones that help you deal with stress include our mineralocorticoids, which bring our what? Our sodium levels up. What else is brought up? Water, which brings your blood volume up, which correlates to your blood pressure. So mineralocorticoids can bring your blood pressure up to help you deal with that stressful event. They can also bring up what? Our glucocorticoids can help bring not only our glucose, but what other nutrients could we elevate? Carbohydrates. So other carbohydrates besides glucose. What else? Proteins, amino acids. That will be all elevated during long-term stress to power your bodies, if you will, your cells, through that stressful event. So basically, the adrenal cortex picks up where the adrenal medulla leaves off if your stressful event prolongs. Does that make any sense at all? So our short-term stress, epinephrine, bring heart rate up, blood pressure up. But if we need to maintain it, we call in these endocrine, the hormones from the adrenal cortex. Keep that heart rate up, keep your blood volume up, keep your blood pressure up, keep your nutrients up. What's an offset if this prolongs? What if your stress prolongs
and it's gotten where it's maybe too long. What happens? What do we say is one effect of these, say, glucocorticoids? May even have adrenal fatigue. So even before, so that would be like really bad. Even before then, what's going to happen? What is one other effect of the glucocorticoids? What do they do? It suppresses your immune system. You become sick after a period of what? Stress. Every fall, winter break, after finals, what happens to everybody? Sick. You get a break, but then you're sick, right? So you've been stressed, you've been worried, your immune system is depressed, and so you just go out, expose to the common cold, and you're down. Okay, for a period of time, or maybe get something worse. So the next image just visually just summarizes what we just talked about. How short-term stress is acknowledged or handled through the adrenal medulla's release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then any prolonged stress is handled by the release of our glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids by the adrenal cortex. Looks like figures 6.9 and 6.11 illustrate the role of the mineralocorticoids and the glucocorticoids. What questions do you have over the cortex or the medulla before we move over to the pancreas? All right, pancreas it is. The last organ that we're going to talk about is the pancreas. And we're not going to talk about all of the hormones which it produces. And additionally, we've not hit all of the endocrine glands in the body. We're just hitting some more prominent ones for regulating some major processes in our body. The pancreas is adjacent to the digestive system in your abdominal cavity. And it secretes not only hormones, but it also produces exocrine products as well. So if you turn your attention to figure 610C, it gives you a light microscope image of the pancreas. If you're looking at a stained image, you may see some darker shaded areas and some lighter shaded areas. And then, of course, there should be a good vasculature because we are going to secrete these hormones into the blood. But there's also exocrine products that are secreted into a duct. And so there's blood vessels and ducts in the pancreas. The exocrine producing cells are referred to as the acinar cells. These eight, does anybody know what they ate in? Acinar cells, what do they produce? Kind of. You had nutrition? These will produce digestive enzymes that help facilitate digestion. Right? So what that tells me is we're not going to study them. They're not a hormone. We're going to turn our attention to the cells in between those called the islets of Langerhans. They look like little islands, hence the name. The islets of Langerhans, there are three types of cells in here. It's called alpha cells, beta cells, and gamma cells. We're going to look exclusively at the alpha and the beta cells and their production of two antagonistic hormones. You know the two antagonistic hormones? Insulin and glucagon. Glucagon is a hormone antagonistic to insulin. I'm just going to say it just to answer your curiosity, but we're not going to study the pathway. The delta cells produce a hormone called somatostatin, which previously we would just call growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Where did we see it produced by? Growth hormone inhibiting hormone tells us that's from the not it? Not it? Hypothalamus. If you remember, hypothalamus produces our releasing and inhibiting hormone. This hormone is also, this growth hormone inhibiting hormone we would call somatostatin. It's produced by the delta cells of the pancreas. So just putting it out there so you know. But we're going to look exclusively at the alpha and the beta cells. in the production of insulin and glucagon. Insulin is produced by the beta cells of the pancreas. How do you think it's regulated? Humorally, in response to blood sugar levels that are high. Not only just sugars, anybody else know what other molecules this might be responsive to? Not just sugars, but probably also lipids and cholesterol would fall into the lipid category. Amino acids or proteins. Okay, so it is definitely humorally regulated to elevated levels of nutrients. So when would you see insulin normally released? After eating. So after a meal, your blood nutrient levels will go up. Whether it be glucose, proteins, or lipids, or variants thereof. What do you think it will target then? What do you think insulin primarily targets? The circulatory system just circulates it. And so we can't directly target the blood. We can't directly target the blood. We can change the composition of the blood, but we have to target some cell types. What cell types can we target with insulin to change the blood glucose content? Which cells could we target? I don't, it may target the intestines, but I don't know. That's not going to be there probably are insulin receptors in the intestine, but I don't know how many. I don't know how expressive they are there. But you'll see a lot at the liver. I don't know how much of the kidneys. Again, it may be there, but I don't know how much. A lot of our insulin receptors are at the liver to do what? Take up sugars. So at the liver, insulin will tell your liver cells to take the glucose from the blood and put it in the liver cell. So it's a way of storing your groceries, basically. Okay. So it causes your liver cells, to take in glucose and store it in the form of what? What can your liver store your glucose as? Glycogen. Glycogen is a big macromolecule. Yeah, prefix something to do with sugars. Okay. The end is the telling part usually. Okay, so it's going to target your liver to do what? We said to store glucose. But we can also target our skeletal muscles to do what? You may metabolize it before it's really going to do the same thing and tell your muscle cells to store. You can store the glucose as glycogen. You can also store what? What else could you store in your muscles? You can store glucose in the form of glycogen. What else could my muscles, my big bulging muscles, what could they store? Come on.
Energy?
What do your muscles store? Proteins. Come on now. It's the other ones that are good at the fat. But you can target your fat cells to store lipids, right? Do I need to go to the gym that bad?
No, we're just all about fat today.
Give me some fat. I'm good. It tells your cells to store those excessive nutrients. So if I go eat, if I go upstairs and I gorge myself on peanuts from the vending machine, I'm not going to have just sugars. I'm going to have proteins and other fats.
And so my body says, ooh, this is good, I can use this later, let's store it, right? So you can store sugars in your liver, the proteins in your muscle cells, and the fats in your, the lipids in your fat tissue. Sugar can even go in your fat tissue and be converted over to lipid storage. And so, tells your cells to do what? Store those nutrients. And once they are taken from the blood, they're stored in your side of your cells, your blood levels are back at, hopefully, set point. But you didn't get rid of the nutrients because there's going to be a period of time where you don't have any food. And so we could then do what with it? Use it, release it, or use it. And so if we turn to an insulin, we said it's going to transfer your nutrients, not just sugar, but any other nutrients from the blood and store it into your cells. And so it promotes more anabolic type reactions. We said this hormone is antagonistic to another hormone produced by the pancreas, which is called glucagon. Glucagon is produced by the alpha cells. And how is it controlled? Humorally, in response to decreased levels of what? Nutrients. So sugars, proteins, lipids. When those blood levels fall below set point, the pancreas is going to secrete glucagon. What do you think it's going to target? Liver, muscle, fat, to do what? Release those nutrients into the blood to bring your blood levels back up to set point. With that, covers our discussion of the hormones of the endocrine system. So what I do is take a second to field any questions that you may have about the endocrine system, and then we'll use the last 20 minutes to talk about, introduce the skeletal muscle physiology. For transitioning to chapter 12, if you look at the layout of the textbook, this flows right off of chapter 11, how our peripheral nervous system can efferently control our effector organs. So it just flows right off of how the somatic nervous system can control your skeletal muscle, but the autonomic nervous system will duly innervate your heart and your smooth muscle. So this chapter is going to be primarily dedicated to skeletal muscles, but the end of it is going to focus a lot on smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. However, cardiac muscle will be covered in more detail in chapter 13. And we're going to get an introduction to it in lab this week as well. So if we start out chapter 12, looking at our objectives, we're going to, not today, but we're going to review, like we did in lab, some structural features of a skeletal muscle and look at those cellular features and what they do. We're also going to talk about excitation, contraction, coupling. We also introduced this in lab last week about how action potentials are conducted down the T-tubules to cause the leak of sarcoplasmic calcium. And then we'll introduce how contraction actually happens. We'll get into that next time on Thursday. And then we'll look at contraction with this thing called the sliding filament model and contraction itself. And then we're going to also talk about how we can change the force of contractions. We know that not all cells need to generate the same amount of tension for smaller or more big types of movement. But what we're going to start out with item 6. We're going to compare and contrast each of our 3 types of muscles. And then at the end of the chapter, we're going to talk about single unit and multi-unit smooth muscle, and then integrate the role of a pacemaker in single unit smooth muscle and in the heart as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and introduce the muscle physiology by comparing and contrasting each of the 3 types. If you've got your guided notes,
On the cell appearance, you'll see an actual image in your guided notes on the cell appearance. But I'm going to give you a structural description, so if you want to make a mark above or below, so you can write a word in there to describe the cell appearance. I just didn't give you physical room in there, so we'll make that addition to your guided notes. What are the three types of muscles that we have? We have smooth muscle, cardiac, and skeletal muscle. They're all going to vary in their location, how the cell appears, and the primary functions. Also, the type of control is different. I wasn't able to squeeze that on here, so it'll be on a different, on the next slide, but we'll go ahead and verbally fill it in and you can check your work. So the first tissue we're going to look at is called skeletal muscle. Where do you find skeletal muscle? And you find it on your skeleton, so it's attached to your bones. Some skeletal muscle may be attached to skin. Okay, so not all skeletal muscle has to be attached to a bone, but the bulk share of your skeletal muscles are attached to bones. Our skeletal muscle appears, what term can we use to describe skeletal muscle cell appearance? Striated, S-T-R-I-A-T-E-D, striated. Our skeletal muscle cells are visually striated, which means they look striped. It's dark and light altering banding of the skeletal muscle cells. When we get into in better detail, we'll study what causes that banding pattern when we look at these things called sarcomeres. What are some functions of our skeletal muscles? What are some functions? One function we know is to do what? Movement. And heat production is the second primary function of skeletal muscle. The heat production is probably a little lesser known by the average person, but skeletal muscles, when they contract, yes, they give us motility and locomotion, but they also produce a lot of heat, which makes sense if you've ever been cold. What do? You shiver or maybe move around. About 60% of the workload transferred, energy transferred by skeletal muscle is heat. About 60% of the energy transferred by your skeletal muscles is heat. So it tells you only 40% is used for movement, for contraction. How are skeletal muscles controlled? How are they controlled? Voluntarily. So by which nervous system is that? Somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system gives you voluntary control over your skeletal muscles. A second type of muscle tissue is called cardiac muscle, and it is located where? In the heart. It makes up your atria, and it makes up your ventricles. So like of the heart, somewhere around 99% of the cells of the heart itself are the myocardial or the contractile cells of the heart. The cardiac muscles also appear how? Striated. They are also striated. What is the function of our cardiac muscle? To pump blood. Okay, to pump and distribute blood. How is our heart controlled? It's involuntary, not only the sympathetic, but also parasympathetic. So which nervous system controls your heart? Autonomic nervous system, both subdivisions. Because the heart is dually innervated. heart is controlled? How else is our heart controlled? So the autonomic nervous system is the neural control, but it's also controlled how? Intrinsically. Very good. That means what? By itself. The heart can control itself by way of what? Cells. Cells called the SA node, or we could just say a pacemaker. Okay, so we have some pacemaker cells in the heart, which give intrinsic control of a heart contraction. A third muscle type is called what? What's the third one? Smooth muscle. It is located where? Organs that are what? Like the intestine, that are hollow. You'll find smooth muscle in hollow organs except for the heart. The heart technically is hollow too, but cardiac muscle makes up the heart. And so all of the hollow organs, like your esophagus, stomach, intestines, uterus, bladder, all have what type of muscle? Smooth muscle. And the way to describe its appearance is smooth. And where you find smooth muscle, it's going to there to move something through that particular hollow organ. So if you're looking in the stomach, it's going to mix and churn and propel the digestive process. If it's lining a blood vessel, it's there to propel blood through the vessel, or allow blood flow through. In the uterus, it's there to contract and aid in parturition or delivery of a baby. If it's in the bladder, it's there to get urine out of the bladder, right? So it's there to move substances through that particular hollow organ. How is our smooth muscle controlled? How is the smooth muscle controlled? Involuntary, so we can say which nervous system? Autonomic. And also, some smooth muscle is controlled how? Intrinsically, because some smooth muscle also has what?
Contractions.
Has what? What can give us intrinsic control over a muscle? Cells that act as a, check the work on the previous.
Control center.
No, but we didn't use that word. A pacemaker. Some smooth muscles also have a pacemaker, which gives those cells intrinsic control of smooth muscle contraction. Some smooth muscles have pacemakers also. Not all.
What are some examples?
Some examples of where you would find pacemaker cells are in your digestive system, so that all of your intestines would work together. Yeah, all the cells of your intestines would work together. So all the cells in the stomach would work together. Is where you'll find a pacemaker. And so just the presence of food can stretch those cells and they'll get to work. You don't need the nervous system to say, hey, there's food there, get to work. And the digestive system's like, I got it. And tell me what to do. I got it. But not all smooth muscle has pacemakers, and we'll differentiate that at the end of this chapter. What I want to do is use the remaining 7 minutes to review the structure that we studied in lab, so you're ready to go for our upcoming quiz. The first thing is that we differentiated a skeletal muscle organ versus a muscle cell, and just reiterating what we learned in chapter 1, that an organ is a compilation of different what? Tissues. And so in a skeletal muscle organ, not only will you find skeletal muscle cells, but you'll find, say, connective tissue. You will find blood vessels, which have they're actually organs themselves, and so they would have all their various tissues. We know that there would be sensory afferent nerves
aiding in proprioception.